Hello there. Prior to the 19th century, the Philippines, a Spanish colony, and the mainland states of Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, which was then known as Siam, and Vietnam, which was also known as Annam, were the only recognisable political units in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore did not exist at all, and most of island Southeast Asia was fragmented into a host of principalities and powers of varying sizes and strengths, some of which were under direct European control, such as Portuguese Timor and Dutch-controlled Java. The collapse of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, in 1799, and the subsequent takeover of the company's holdings by the Netherlands government, not only consolidated and strengthened the Dutch presence throughout the archipelago, but also led to the creation of Indonesia's modern borders. Burma, Laos and Cambodia, as well as Vietnam, only came under European colonial rule during the 19th century. The colonial powers conquered existing kingdoms with large settled populations that shared in each case a common religion and spoke the same or related regional languages. Thailand was never colonised, but its borders were essentially defined by what the Western powers, in this case Britain and France, chose not to claim. This was partly an outcome of existing great power rivalries in Europe at that time. Only a few of the new nations existed in any sense of the term nation before the colonial era. Therefore, it is evident that the colonial experience created the contemporary political map of much of Southeast Asia. Colonialism brought into being new nations occupying particular parcels of territory that had not been politically marked out in that way before. Consolidation and/or acquisition of colonial territories in Southeast Asia by European powers, including America, in 1898 when it gained control of the Philippines following its victory in the Spanish-American War, expanded rapidly during the 19th century. The quest for empire, especially during the period of the so-called New Imperialism, circa 1870 to 1914, coincided with the rise of industrial capitalism. The resultant accumulations of capital surplus fueled a demand for new markets and investment opportunities. Modern technological and engineering advances altered the distance between colony and coloniser. For example, the telegraph, steam engines, the opening of the Suez Canal were all so-called tools of empire, as Hedrick describes them, the products of 19th century Western ingenuity. Colonies not only offered strategic and economic advantages, for example, new resources such as raw materials, cheap labour, new markets and new areas of investment, but they were considered to be a reflection of the colonising nation's power and prestige. As the 19th century advanced, the direct and indirect processes of imperialism drew Southeast Asian societies more tightly into the global economy. Not only were modern forms of communication and technology, such as railway, steamship, the telegraph line, introduced to the region, but so were elements of modern science and Western philosophies. Colonial powers attempted to justify their presence in the region on both moral and ethical grounds, that it was a white man's burden to bring modernity and progress to the so-called uncivilized parts of the world. They drew on the now discredited theory of social Darwinism, which was based on Darwin's theories of evolution. They attempted to justify entrenched notions of racial superiority among the colonising powers. Later, the doctrine of evolution was applied to relations among nations, but there were also unintended consequences for colonial rule. Patterns of interaction within Southeast Asia also changed during this process. For the first time, the peoples of the region could communicate with their societies and across national boundaries as never before. People were connected to a larger world through newspapers, for example, beyond their immediate horizons and knowledge, given rise to what Benedict Anderson terms an imagined community of shared experiences, common grievances, and an increasing level of resentment towards colonial rule. Colonialism also transformed the content of the states that emerged in the middle of last century. when many of these states emerged as nation states. At some point last century, the 20th century, mostly after World War II, new states emerged that saw themselves as nations in a world of nation states. They were states that expressed a new sense of national pride and organisational expression of a particular national spirit, and in most cases, they were nation states that had been created and often fought for by nationalist movements. There were two basic kinds of reactions towards European colonialism on the part of Southeast Asians. One was opposition and resistance, and the other was adaptation. The nationalist movements that emerged in Southeast Asia in the late 19th and early 20th century were both a form of resistance to Western colonialism and an adaptation to it. Obviously, the Southeast Asian nationalist movements resisted Western colonial rule. They were formed in opposition to colonial rulers, but they were also adaptations to the modern world brought by the colonial rulers. Nationalism, at least in the modern sense, involving the creation of a nation-state with defined national boundaries and the concept of citizenships, is a Western concept. Colonialism brought the modern nation-state and the modern concept of national identity and nationalism to Southeast Asia. This was not, of course, done intentionally. In a sense, the colonial states had brought with them the seeds of their own destruction, and that seed was the concept of nationalism.